Chris Donnell returned to his home in the hills after just 5 days away. He had left with a clear mind and a confident stride, expecting to handle a brief business matter in Nevada and return to the quiet order of his life in Northern California. His home sat at the top of a secluded slope, just off a winding private road, buffered by oak trees and old stone walls. It wasn't just a house, it was a working project, a living showcase of light design, something Chris had built up over years. He wasn't an engineer or a recluse or some misunderstood artist. He was a practical man with a clear idea of aesthetics and boundaries, both literally and figuratively. His property featured a fully legal and partially autonomous lighting system powered by solar arrays and a buried backup battery grid, all registered, inspected, and certified by local code enforcement. His lights weren't garish or excessive. They were measured, architectural, strategically positioned beams that illuminated the stone path curves, accentuated the contours of the garden terraces, and gave soft presence to the home's silhouette at night. It was subtle power, not meant to draw attention but to say, someone lives here with intention. But that night, as his plane touched down and he took the long drive home, nothing looked as it should. From the main road, he could already tell the slope was dark. No soft uplighting on the olive trees, no glowing grid on the rock path, just a black patch where his home should have glowed like a low ember under the stars. He assumed the system had shut down temporarily. Perhaps a breaker had tripped or a storm had passed through, but as he turned the corner and drove up the gravel incline, something deeper tugged at him. The air was still, but not peacefully so. It felt paused, interfered with. He parked, stepped out, and approached his front gate, sensing that it wasn't a power failure, it was a cut. Inside, the house was dead. Fridge thawed, UPS systems blinking red, thermostat off, the wall control panels unresponsive. He opened the access panel to the central array and found the core reading, no live input. The diagnostics flashed back an error he hadn't seen in years. Downline obstruction. It wasn't a local failure. The main feed had been severed, somewhere between his terminal node and the neighborhood grid. Chris didn't panic. He was too seasoned for that. He'd built the system himself, worked with contractors personally, dealt with city permits, power audits, and homeowner disputes. But this felt too clean, too deliberate. He opened the underground vault near the driveway where the line connected with the shared grid. It had been resealed, not damaged, resealed, and badly at that. The dirt was fresh, tamped down in a rush without water or pack. It looked like someone had dug up his connection and walked away like nothing happened. He called the power company. After 3 transfers and a 20-minute hold, a young tech support agent told him there were no outages, no maintenance, and no record of any service to his line. He was still listed as active. Chris insisted. After another pause, the agent hesitated and said she could see a third-party service notice logged from 3 days earlier, marked as resolved, but there were no notes on who authorized it. Chris asked for a supervisor. They told him the third party in question was local administration, flagged under safety operations, which in his experience could mean anything from a broken sidewalk to a transformer replacement. But no one had the authority to disconnect a private residence without notice, unless there had been a public hazard, and no one had contacted him. By morning, Chris had restored minimal power using his emergency generator. He wasn't interested in theatrics. He needed refrigeration, security, cameras, and his internal diagnostics back online. But what struck him more than the outage was how perfectly targeted it was. None of the actual wiring on his property had been disturbed. Only the point of feed, just enough to take him offline but leave no obvious damage. As the system came back online, Chris checked his network logs. His internal grid had flagged a power loss at 2:41 a.m., 4 nights earlier. The sensors registered pressure on the soil above the conduit vault. Movement detected, then a sharp loss in voltage. At exactly 2:43 a.m., the line went dead. The last exterior camera recording showed two unmarked vehicles parked near the club building at the bottom of the hill, which doubled as the neighborhood's communal space, gym, office, voting room, complaint box, and, most importantly, a power node. For several shared utilities, Chris didn't have many neighbors, and he liked it that way. The area was mostly larger lots, set back from the main roads. Privacy was baked into the land. But what passed for a community board here wasn't a gathering of well-meaning retirees. It was a small but rigid group of self-appointed monitors led by Dottie Clemens. She was in her 60s, overweight, always dressed like she was headed to court, and ran every meeting like a Senate inquiry. Dottie had never liked Chris's lighting system. She claimed it disrupted the character of the hill. She once filed a complaint about the angle of one uplight that allegedly cast glare onto the outer wall of the clubhouse's yoga room. The complaint was dismissed, but the tone was set. Chris's project wasn't just unwelcome, it was watched. So when he found his system cut and no one admitted to touching it, he didn't need a name. He knew who was behind it. But it wasn't just the sabotage. It was what came next. That night, as he drove down to check the public access lights along the hill, he noticed something strange. The clubhouse was fully illuminated. Not the usual soft glow on the walkway, but industrial-grade beam lights installed on the roofline, over the entrance, and down the slope. His slope. Chris recognized the color temperature, the projection angles. They were using his configuration, his design, but they weren't pulling from the main city grid. The meters read 0. They were using local power. Someone had rerouted supply, maybe through shared grounds, maybe directly off his own system before cutting it. Chris walked the perimeter, noting the subtle equipment, his model of battery cell, his backup array mount. They hadn't just mimicked him, they had siphoned from him. Installed new gear where his energy was once sent. It was theft, but it was done through the language of bureaucracy. Plausible upgrades, community interest, energy optimization. And he hadn't been notified once. He didn't make a scene. He returned home, documented everything, and made 3 calls. One to his lawyer, one to his contractor, and one to the Office of Public Utilities. He wasn't going to scream at Dottie or storm into a meeting. That wasn't how power worked here. Instead, he began to plan. Not for vengeance, but for light. Because if they wanted a war over energy, visibility, and presence, they'd chosen the wrong man to provoke in the dark. Chris didn't waste time with guesswork. The morning after confirming the blackout and the unauthorized rerouting of his system, he began documenting every component that had been tampered with. The utility box near the driveway was untouched on the surface, but when he removed the protective panel, he found 2 new clamps placed over the main feed line, industrial grade, tagged with a batch number and stamped with a third-party inspection. Seal that didn't match the ones his system used. It wasn't a hack job. Someone had planned this operation, and they had access to real service tools, the kind that didn't belong to any ordinary resident or contractor. These were permits-only components installed with precision and speed. It wasn't vandalism, it was procedure, performed without notification, likely under the cover of some manufactured pretense of community safety. He returned to his office and called Allison Crane, his legal consultant. Allison had helped him secure permits during the original installation of his light grid, and she had a sharp instinct for administrative sleight of hand. After describing what he had found, Chris emailed her photographs of the box, serial numbers, and the soil disturbance markers. She called back within the hour. Her tone was clipped. Someone's leveraging a quiet ordinance. She explained that while no one could cut off power without a direct code violation or court order, there was a narrow clause in the regional homeowners charter that allowed for emergency energy interventions, if and only if a certified report indicated that an independent grid posed a public disruption or danger. It was a clause no one had ever enforced, until now. Chris immediately requested the report. It took 2 more calls and a formal letter from Allison to the district board before the document was emailed to them. It was only 3 pages long and unsigned. An unsigned safety review citing complaints of intermittent glare affecting night visibility, and a single paragraph alleging the possibility of energy bleed into shared power infrastructure. That last phrase made Chris pause. It was fiction, but it was dangerous fiction. Energy bleed was the kind of vague, technical-sounding accusation that could scare just enough bureaucrats into compliance. And the fact that the report had no author and no timestamp suggested one thing. It had been fabricated after the fact, submitted to justify what had already been done. He stared at the file and felt the anger knot into something colder. Calculation. They weren't just annoyed with his presence or his design choices. They were making a case that he was a liability, something that had to be neutralized for the good of the neighborhood. Chris knew exactly who stood behind that kind of language. Dottie Clemens had spent the last year trying to undermine any initiative that she couldn't control. And now she had found a way to do it without confrontation. By creating a fictional hazard, she had triggered a process that bypassed his consent entirely. And then she had used that breach to reroute energy to the community center, where, as he had seen, his own components or their commercial replicas were powering the same lighting design she once called aggressive. Allison, sensing his silence on the call, warned him not to respond emotionally. This is political, not personal. That makes it dangerous, and it means they're betting you'll retaliate with noise or threats. Don't document. Build the case. Let them overplay their hand. Chris agreed. He knew better than to charge in. Instead, he began a systematic survey of his property. He walked every conduit line, confirmed every output, and checked the integrity of the subsurface cabling. When he reached the north quadrant, an area that ran adjacent to the club building's utility shed, he found fresh marker flags in the ground, orange and yellow, the kind used by surveyors. They were positioned in a straight line, leading from his buried capacitor trench to the outer retaining wall that bordered the shared zone. The message was clear. Someone was preparing a claim, either to redraw the property boundary or to argue that a section of his system extended into the community's regulatory jurisdiction. He photographed everything. Then, with gloved hands, he traced the edge of his capacitor trench and unearthed a set of shallow grooves. Scratches left in the soil by a flathead spade, the kind used to gently lift cable without damaging it. Whoever had accessed the trench had done so carefully. Not like a thief, but like a technician. Chris covered the area and marked it for later inspection. Then he returned to the house, where the generator hummed steadily, and began writing a formal request to the County Office of Public Infrastructure. He wanted official recognition that his buried systems had been previously inspected, registered, and were not part of any shared grid. He attached old diagrams, permit approvals, and installation photos. Allison reviewed the draft and approved it with minor edits. That evening, Chris reviewed the footage again. He scrolled through frames captured from his secondary camera, an angle positioned on the eastern slope that hadn't been disabled. At exactly 3:06 a.m. on the second night of his absence, the lens picked up a human silhouette moving near the boundary wall. The figure wore a reflective vest. The footage wasn't crisp enough to confirm an identity, but the posture was unmistakable. Short, broad, deliberate. The timestamp correlated with the line cut. Chris didn't need to see a face to know who had orchestrated it. But again, he didn't act. He saved the video, encrypted the file, and archived it. Then he began rebuilding his lighting system, not in the same layout but in a modified configuration. One that wouldn't just illuminate his home, one that could project, respond, and isolate. He wasn't preparing to retaliate. He was preparing to demonstrate, to make a point so visibly, so incontrovertibly clear that it couldn't be buried under reports or masked with false narratives. Light was his language, and he intended to speak it fluently. When the generator reached full charge and the system rebooted, he activated only the perimeter zones. low-level lighting that cast narrow beams up along the slope, like the vertebrae in a spine. He left the central node off. The house remained dark inside. From a distance, it looked dormant. And that's exactly how he wanted it to appear: quiet, unthreatening, neutral. Because in places like this, silence is the perfect camouflage for escalation. And Chris Donnell was done waiting for permission. Chris understood the value of timing. He didn't respond immediately to the fake safety report or the repurposing of his power. He didn't march down to the community clubhouse or confront Dottie Clemens in her element. Instead, he waited. Not out of hesitation, but because escalation required precision. And for a man who had spent most of his life working in architectural design with integrated lighting systems, precision was second nature. He used the next 48 hours to prepare, not for a spectacle, but for a statement. Quietly, methodically, he rewired his restored lighting array into a new configuration, one that moved away from his traditional uplighting and toward a more tactical layout. Long-throw projectors hidden in the landscaping, powered by isolated batteries that weren't connected to the main generator. He adjusted the angle of incidence on each beam, recalibrated the temperature and spread, and tested the sweep of the optics in the early hours of the morning when no one was watching. The new system wasn't designed to impress. It was designed to assert. While he worked, his lawyer Allison continued her part. She issued 2 official notices. One to the Regional Utility Compliance Office, contesting the unauthorized modification of his line, and another to the board of the Neighborhood Association, demanding a written explanation for the intervention on his property. The board responded with a formal letter signed by Dottie herself, filled with legal platitudes and vague language about community standards and preventative action. It didn't acknowledge fault. It didn't even reference the specific incident. It simply stated that, after a series of complaints about inconsistent lighting patterns and community disruption, the board authorized a review and acted in accordance with neighborhood guidelines. There was no apology, no admission, just posture. Chris printed the letter and pinned it to his workshop wall. Not as a trophy, but as a declaration of what they believed they could get away with. That evening, just after sunset, he initiated the first full activation of his revised lighting program. The perimeter beams flared to life first. Thin, white lines slicing through the slope like the teeth of a rake, drawing clean geometry against the hill. Then, from the southern tree line, a series of narrow projectors bathed the community clubhouse in a sheet of cold, white light. Not blinding, but unmistakably deliberate. It wasn't a flood. It was a focus, as if someone had drawn a square around the building with light and said, This is where it begins." The effect was immediate. Within 20 minutes, Chris received 3 text messages from neighbors, all variations of the same concern. Why was the clubhouse lit up like a stage set? Was something happening? Should someone call the board? Chris didn't respond. He didn't need to. By the time Dottie arrived, 40 minutes later, dressed in one of her linen blazers and flanked by 2 board members, the light had already done its work. The area around the clubhouse was silent, exposed and buzzing with curiosity. Chris watched from his second-floor balcony, eyes scanning the tree line below. He didn't record anything. That wasn't his goal. He was watching for behavior, not evidence. Dottie stood in the beam's path, squinting upward, trying to locate the source. She shouted something unintelligible, likely assuming he was somewhere in earshot. But Chris didn't respond. The light wasn't a message to her. It was a demonstration to everyone else that the person she tried to silence still had control. That their unauthorized tampering hadn't gone unnoticed. That visibility wasn't optional anymore. By morning, the board had issued a new notice. Unauthorized projection of high-intensity lighting toward shared community property will not be tolerated. They referenced fictitious noise complaints, misquoted zoning codes, and warned of potential safety implications for senior members of the community. Chris sent it directly to Allison, who responded within the hour with a letter of her own, this time not as a request, but as a formal warning. She pointed out that the lighting was positioned entirely within the bounds of Chris's own property, that it met county illumination limits, and that there was no statutory basis for enforcing control over directionality unless glare thresholds were exceeded, which they weren't. The board went silent for 3 days. On the 4th night, Chris noticed movement on the northern edge of his property. He had installed infrared sensors just beyond the slope, triggered not by wildlife, but by temperature thresholds calibrated for human presence. At 2:13 a.m., the alert pinged his internal network. No sound, no spotlight, just a silent notification. He stood in the dark and watched the live feed from his tablet. 2 silhouettes moving low through the brush, following the same flagged path he had marked earlier. One carried a short-handled spade. The other wore a headlamp that flickered off and on every few seconds. They weren't vandals. They were scanning, searching for something. Chris remained calm. He didn't confront them. Instead, he let the program run. As the figures moved deeper into the slope, a secondary light grid activated, not in warning, but in response. Thin lines of white cut horizontally across the slope, like threads pulled taut across a frame. The figures froze. The lights weren't bright, but they revealed everything. The path, the posture, the tools, and the fact that one of them was wearing an official maintenance vest with the neighborhood logo stitched on the chest. They didn't run. They retreated, quietly. But they had seen the line, and they knew they had crossed it. The next morning, Chris found new flags near the trench, pink this time signaling pending inspection. He removed them, photographed them, stored them. Then he called the Municipal Land Records Office and submitted a request for boundary reaffirmation. Not because he needed it, but because he wanted an official statement that his line had not changed, that his soil was his, and that any intrusion was a breach. He paid the expedited fee. The clerk on the line noted that a similar request had been filed the day before, by the board. They were trying to preempt his move. That same afternoon, a technician from the city's infrastructure department arrived, neutral, professional, clipboard in hand. Chris walked him through the site, explained the tampering, the rerouting, and the lighting program. The man nodded, took notes, and said he would file a report. As he left, he glanced back toward the clubhouse and said, "Looks like they poked the wrong hornet." Chris didn't respond. He simply returned to his workbench and began drawing a new schematic, this one for an even more refined optical pattern. He wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. He was trying to tell a story of control, of presence, of who really governed the slope after dark. The board had escalated, and now they were facing someone who understood escalation not as aggression, but as geometry, an architecture of assertion. And it had only just begun. Several days after the trench incident and the subtle retreat of the trespassers, Chris found something new in his mailbox. A heavy envelope with no return address, no official markings, just his name typed plainly. Inside was a loosely structured document filled with vague threats, misquoted legal terminology, and phrases like intentional disruption, hostile illumination, and community intimidation. It was unsigned, undated, and clearly designed to sound official without risking the weight of actual legal formality. Chris didn't react emotionally. He simply cataloged it, scanned it, and filed it alongside the growing pile of artifacts that now defined his opposition. Documents that weren't lies exactly, but something more dangerous. Deliberate distortions. He didn't need to prove who sent it. The handwriting was already etched into every passive-aggressive paragraph. The campaign against him was no longer covert. It had moved past interference and into manipulation. The board was now trying to frame his entire lighting system as a threat, twisting perception into authority, dressing petty retribution as civic duty. So, Chris shifted his own approach. Instead of merely maintaining the system, he began reshaping it, transforming it from a display into a dynamic field of interaction. He designed a series of narrow-spectrum beams that didn't just illuminate space, but responded to it. Small adjustments in color, density, and path could now track movement without cameras or sound. The effect was eerie to those who didn't understand it. Light that seemed to follow you, anticipate your steps, and retreat when challenged. This new array was deployed quietly. There were no grand activations or neighborhood displays. It simply came online, invisible until approached, calm until triggered. When neighbors walked too close to his boundary, curious, hesitant, or just unaware, they were met not with floodlights but with quiet sequences. A soft arc across the lawn, a gentle pulse at the edges of their shoes, or a subtle ring expanding outward, like ripples in water. It was unmistakably intentional, but it wasn't hostile. It simply said, "You've been noticed." The board responded the only way they knew how, with bureaucracy. A formal complaint was submitted to the county land office, alleging that Chris had modified his infrastructure beyond permitted zoning allowances. The document included manipulated photos of his lighting fixtures, angled to exaggerate their intensity, cropped to make distances look shorter than they were. Chris recognized the tactics. When you couldn't win on facts, you reshaped the frame. He immediately contacted Allison and initiated a counter-response, a certified third-party audit of his power system, fully compliant and independently verified. The results did more than clear him. They exposed the board's fabrication. Not only had Chris remained within his property line and power allotment, the audit confirmed that during the exact period his own system had been down, external feeds from his infrastructure had supplied energy to the community center without authorization. In simple terms, they had rerouted his power, used it for their own needs, and then accused him of misconduct to cover it. It was a quiet form of theft, camouflaged behind regulation and committee signatures. Chris didn't react with outrage. He reacted with alignment. He compiled the audit, included photographic evidence, cross-referenced zoning approvals, and wrote a brief statement of facts. He printed the documents, labeled each section, and prepared a public record submission. Then he waited. The next community meeting was scheduled soon after. It was routine, low attendance, mostly retirees, casual conversations over weak coffee and awkward folding chairs. Chris arrived unannounced, not dressed for conflict but dressed simply, with a windbreaker and boots still dusty from the slope. He didn't sit in front, didn't demand the floor. He waited until the standard topics were exhausted. Street lamp replacements, recycling compliance, herbicide bans. And then he stood, walked to the table, and calmly placed his folder in front of Dottie Clemens without looking her in the eye. She tried to intercept him with procedural noise, declaring the floor closed, demanding submission forms. But Chris spoke without raising his voice. He didn't lecture or argue. He simply stated that the contents of the folder included a certified energy audit, a record of property interference, and documented rerouting of private systems by individuals operating without authorization. He referenced applicable zoning statutes, submitted a copy to the county representative in attendance, and stepped back. There was no shouting, no dramatics, only a long, slow silence. Dottie's lips tightened, her hands resting protectively over her planner. But she didn't speak. Chris didn't need her to. He had spoken in the only language the board understood: evidence, order, exposure. Without flinching, he turned and left. Outside, the pathway lights lit up in sequence, not as a display but as punctuation. One by one, they followed him up the slope, their rhythm precise and measured, their purpose no longer aesthetic. They had tried to humiliate him with shadows. He answered with geometry. The silence that followed the meeting was not the kind that brought peace. It was tactical, withheld, like the held breath of an opponent who had been backed into a corner and was deciding whether to concede or retaliate. Chris knew better than to interpret the lack of immediate response as surrender. Bureaucratic retaliation rarely came quickly, but when it did, it often arrived in forms crafted to exhaust rather than confront. True to form, the first sign of the movement wasn't verbal, it was procedural. A registered letter arrived 3 days later, stamped with an embossed county seal and a tone that reeked of forced neutrality. It was an official notice of inspection. The justification was vague. Review of utility access, infrastructure footprint, and zoning conformity. There was no accusation, no claim of violation, just a mandate to allow entry to designated personnel within 7 days. Chris read it twice. The language was deliberate. The request wasn't being made directly by the board, but it had originated from their office, filtered through a backdoor clause in the community's administrative charter. They had found a way to weaponize municipal oversight. If he denied entry, they could claim non-compliance. If he allowed it, they'd use the visit to fabricate further concerns. Either path had risk, but Chris had already chosen his footing. He didn't argue. He didn't stall. He made 2 calls, one to his lawyer and one to a professional property auditor from out of county, someone with no connection to the board and no reason to bend under local pressure. When the inspection day came, Chris stood ready. The county technician arrived first, polite but indifferent, clipboard in hand and wearing the look of someone who had no idea they were being used. Behind him, 2 board members arrived, one familiar, the other new, introduced only as an advisory consultant. Dottie wasn't among them. Chris suspected she preferred to pull strings from distance when legal consequences loomed. The inspector moved through the property with routine precision, checking grounding, battery storage, and cable trench depth. Chris had nothing to hide. Every element of the system was within spec, and the third-party audit remained available as evidence of integrity. But as the inspection neared its end, the so-called consultant stepped beyond the outlined path and moved toward the northeastern fence line, the area closest to the clubhouse property. Chris watched him without speaking. The man crouched, inspected the soil, then pulled out a measuring tape and began extending it across the boundary line, not toward the house, but toward the hillside. He then pulled out a notepad and jotted something down. Chris stepped forward and asked him directly, "What are you measuring?" The man responded with vague authority, "Setback confirmation." But the phrasing was wrong. There was no setback zone in that direction, and no justification for recalculating it unless a change to the legal property line was being pursued, which meant one thing. The board had submitted a reclassification request behind his back. They were trying to redefine his boundary, not through accusation, but through adjustment. If they could shrink his designated space by even a few feet, it would retroactively place parts of his system too close to shared land, and that, in turn, would justify forced removal, fines, or even demolition of components. Chris didn't interfere with the measurement. He let the man finish. Then, after the group had left, he retrieved his own records. He compared survey data, zoning maps, and GIS overlays from before and after the board's formation. The numbers hadn't changed, but the interpretation had. Someone was attempting to redraw the map by exploiting the ambiguity of language and the ignorance of residents. He sent the documents to Allison, who confirmed the move. The board had indeed filed a request for reconsideration of boundaries, a formal appeal to have the slope reclassified as buffer zone land, owned collectively rather than privately. It was audacious, and it was flawed. But it was also dangerous because it came cloaked in legality. Chris responded not with resistance, but with acceleration. He reached out to the Regional Zoning Commission, this time not to defend, but to report. He filed an incident of potential abuse of community governance, backed by documentation, third-party data, and a detailed timeline of interference. The submission was flagged, reviewed, and elevated to a procedural ethics review. The board was now officially under examination, not by residents but by the very agencies they had used to justify their power. And while that process churned slowly through the state's mechanism, Chris moved forward on his own front. He restructured his lighting configuration one more time. This version wasn't experimental. It was strategic. He built modular arrays, small enough to be moved or buried, but powerful enough to create focused projection. The system responded to motion, proximity, and, most importantly, changes in ambient light, meaning any attempt to interfere with his setup would trigger a real-time adjustment. He wasn't building a trap. He was building presence. Not visibility for its own sake, but for accountability. And then he installed one more piece. A narrow-spectrum strobe behind the eastern ridge, angled not toward his property, but upward, into the air above the clubhouse, visible only at night, subtle but inescapable. The beam didn't illuminate the building. It created a ghost. A shape cast by their own structure painted against the sky by his hands. It was a reminder, not a threat, that even in silence, someone was watching. The effect was immediate. Within days, residents began asking questions. Not complaints, but curiosity. What was the light? Was it part of a new project? Was it dangerous? Chris didn't answer. He let the questions circulate. He let uncertainty do what outrage never could. People began to doubt the board's competence. Not because of anything Chris said, but because of what he showed. And then, one night, a second envelope appeared. Like the first, it had no sender. But this time it was hand-delivered, not into his mailbox, but onto his porch. No attempt at stealth, just direct placement. Chris opened it to find a single photograph. A picture of his home taken from the rear, outside the known boundary line, clearly from an elevated position. Along with it, a printed line. Too much light leaves you exposed. It was not signed. It was not typed in any official format. It was a warning, or perhaps a miscalculated threat. Chris scanned the photo, checked the angle, and traced the vantage point. It had been taken from the far side of the slope near the edge of the club building's maintenance shed. He didn't call the police. He didn't panic. He simply went to his internal archive and checked the logs. Motion data confirmed a brief presence near the ridge the night prior. No extended stay, no breach, just a trespasser capturing a single frame and walking away. But now it was personal. Now they weren't hiding behind forms or clauses. They were reaching, testing his reaction, trying to provoke fear. Chris didn't blink. He doubled down. The next morning, he delivered his own envelope, directly to the board's mailbox. Inside was a map, a simple rendering. No names, no threats, just the property lines. His marked in green, theirs in red, and a new color, white, drawn across the club building's roofline. Above it, a note. Light reveals. I suggest we all stay within our lines. He didn't wait for a response. He went home, powered up the grid, and watched as his hill lit up once again, not in warning, but in resolve. The following week passed in a strange, watchful quiet. No new letters arrived, no inspectors reappeared, no board members knocked. The light above the clubhouse remained untouched, casting its pale silhouette into the night like a sentinel. Chris maintained his systems, adjusted voltage tolerances, walked the perimeter twice daily, and documented every small irregularity. A scuffed patch of dirt, an unlocked maintenance gate, a sudden drop in motion activity logs that indicated someone had passed through quickly enough to skirt the sensors. He said nothing. He called no one. But he knew the game hadn't ended. It had simply reached a waiting phase, a stalemate in form but not in intent. He wasn't wrong. On a Thursday, just after dusk, a county vehicle arrived at his gate. No warning, no call ahead. A city compliance officer stepped out, older, experienced, with the posture of someone who'd been called into too many neighbor disputes to take sides too easily. Chris met him at the gate and asked what the visit concerned. The officer explained plainly. A safety complaint had been filed regarding high-intensity lighting and unlicensed infrastructure bordering communal space. It wasn't the first complaint, he said, but it was the first with enough community concern behind it to trigger an in-person review. Chris let him in. He wasn't interested in defiance. He knew the strength of visible calm. As the officer surveyed the lighting installations, Chris provided documentation, permits, certifications, audits, even correspondence showing where his system had been used by the board without consent. The officer nodded, made notes, asked questions, but showed no inclination toward enforcement. When they reached the eastern ridge, where the beam created the rooftop silhouette of the clubhouse, the officer paused longer than usual. He tilted his head, looked at the projection, and asked flatly, "What exactly is this supposed to be?" Chris answered without effect. "It's not supposed to be anything. It's the shape their building makes when exposed to directional light. It's not my structure. It's theirs. I just shine a lamp. They're the ones casting the shadow." The officer said nothing for a while, then closed his clipboard and nodded. "You're within tolerance. If they want to stop casting shadows, they'll need to adjust their building." He left shortly after, and Chris knew something had shifted. The board had reached too far again, and this time their complaint had fallen flat. But the board didn't retreat. The next morning, Chris awoke to the sound of heavy footsteps on gravel and saw 3 uniformed officers walking along the outside of his fence. Their vehicle was parked by the clubhouse, and Dottie stood beside it in a long beige coat, arms crossed. Chris stepped outside, asked what was happening, and was met with a citation. Not a warrant, not a search order, but a formal warning issued under municipal code for creating a hostile atmosphere within shared neighborhood space. It was absurd. Legally weightless, but it was official in form and publicly visible. A display. An attempt to put him on record as an aggressor. Dottie didn't speak to him directly. She simply watched, lips thin, expression frozen somewhere between smugness and apprehension. Chris didn't protest. He took the document, nodded once, and went back inside. Then he did what they never expected. He shut down the lights. Not all of them, just the perimeter. Just enough to darken the ridge and allow the slope to fall into quiet ambiguity. The house remained lit, but without emphasis, like a still body in sleep. The beam over the clubhouse vanished. The rooftop silhouette dissolved into nothing. That night, the hill was quiet. Neutral. For the first time in weeks, Chris let his system sleep. And that's when they moved. He had anticipated it. 2 hours after full dark, motion alerts triggered across the south corridor. Not animals. Not wind. Timed movement. Directed. Deliberate. Silent. Chris monitored from his office, watched as 3 figures crept along the outer edge of his lot, paused near the transformer housing, and crouched low. They didn't wear badges or logos. They moved with the comfort of people who believed they were invisible. One carried a toolbox. Another held a handheld meter. The third stood lookout. Chris didn't confront them. He activated the system, not lights, but recording, mapping, pulse sensors calibrated to body mass and humidity. They worked quickly, moving in short intervals, clearly trained or at least experienced in fieldwork. They pried open the outer panel on the buried node near the north fence where weeks ago the original unauthorized cut had occurred. They connected a small diagnostic unit, checked the flow, then sealed it again. The goal wasn't damage, it was data. They were trying to prove something, or plant something. Chris waited until they were gone, then immediately walked out with gloves and a headlamp. Inside the transformer unit, he found it. A secondary transmitter, no larger than a mobile hotspot, zip-tied to the lower rail. It pulsed faintly, searching for a handshake, likely intended to record fluctuation and use logs, data that could later be weaponized in the form of a new claim, unauthorized broadcast, signal bleed, frequency interference, something esoteric enough to confuse a zoning officer but terrifying enough to stick. He removed it, photographed it, and sealed it in an anti-static bag. Then he returned inside and placed a single call, not to his lawyer, not to the city, but to the Regional Building Authority Oversight Office. There, he requested an appointment for a review of potential code violations by a registered association acting beyond its charter. The receptionist on the other end hesitated when he gave his name, then asked, "Is this about the slope lighting thing?" Chris answered only, "It's about pattern of abuse, and I have evidence." The appointment was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, Chris returned to the hill. He reactivated the light, not broadly, but surgically. A single white beam from beneath the slope, aimed not at the building, but up into the trees. A signal, not of aggression, of readiness, a declaration. And from that moment forward, the lights never went out again. The review by the Regional Building Authority wasn't public, but its effects became visible almost immediately. 2 members of the board quietly resigned before the hearing even took place, citing personal obligations and health reasons, though neither had missed a meeting in years. The review committee, comprised of state-level inspectors and charter law advisors, requested documents, logs, and board correspondence. What they found was a trail of procedural manipulation, non-compliant interventions, and unauthorized infrastructure claims. Actions that, while subtle, formed a clear pattern of institutional overreach. Chris never saw the full report, but he didn't need to. The fallout unfolded in the way the community began to shift, not loudly, but undeniably. The clubhouse entered a maintenance lockdown, officially for repairs, but in truth to avoid further scrutiny. The beam of light that once traced its outline no longer needed to shine. It had done its job. It had exposed, recorded, and ended the myth of silence. Dottie Clemens didn't step down, but she vanished from public visibility. No more meetings, no more letters, no more late-night committee votes disguised as safety concerns. She retained her title for a while longer, holding on to whatever sense of authority remained, but her influence dissolved as quickly as it had been built. Chris never saw her on the slope again, never heard her voice in complaint or command. Her world, once defined by unchecked control, had become smaller, confined by the very boundaries she tried to redraw. Chris didn't gloat. He didn't broadcast his victory or decorate it with passive triumphs. He simply restored what was his. The lighting system remained active, refined, and stable, but its most aggressive features were scaled back. There were no more strobes, no perimeter displays, just clean, ambient light, responsive to presence and respectful of space. He rewired it not as a defense, but as a signature. A reminder that visibility, when honest and precise, is stronger than the loudest accusation. The neighbors who once watched from a distance now nodded in acknowledgement when they passed. A few even stopped to ask about the system, not with suspicion, but with interest. They wanted to understand, not the politics, but the design. Chris offered answers when appropriate, advice when requested, and left silence where it belonged. He understood that most people hadn't taken sides because they hadn't known how. They had watched the conflict unfold like a fog rolling down the slope, uncertain of where it came from or what it meant. Now, with the fog gone, they were seeing the shape of things more clearly. The official reprimand issued to the board was brief but consequential. It limited their authority to propose infrastructure changes without a full member vote, required third-party review for any claim involving private property, and re-established a neutral mediator for any future disputes. Chris didn't attend the final meeting where the changes were announced. He didn't need to. The system had self-corrected, imperfectly perhaps, but with finality. The porch lights on Chris's home now followed a slow fade at night, no longer timed for strategic illumination, but simply aligned with the rhythm of the hillside. The garden paths glowed in warm tones, and the beam that once marked the clubhouse roof was replaced with a subtle uplight that bathed the nearest oak tree, its branches casting gentle shadows over the gravel. The land, once a battlefield of power and reaction, had returned to its intended shape, grounded, deliberate, and unclaimed by fear. There was one final envelope, delivered weeks later, not from the board, but from the Office of Property Records. Inside was a single sheet confirming a legal reaffirmation of Chris's boundary lines, signed and sealed by the Zoning Commission. At the bottom was a handwritten note in blue ink, unsigned, but clearly from the case officer who'd walked the slope himself. It read, "Consider your hill. Officially your hill." Some lines don't move. Chris pinned the note to the wall of his workshop, not as a trophy but as closure. He never lit the beam again. He didn't have to.